Good morning, everybody. Hey, everybody. Let's go ahead and find a seat. Hey, everybody. Let's go ahead and find a seat, everybody. Let's go ahead and find a seat. Y'all haven't seen each other in 3 days, so it's been a while. That's all that matters. Two things to get us started. I know. It's just the ladies in the back.
Ladies? We start taking names.
I'm going to start.
We'll write names on the board.
Joyce, you're in trouble. That makes it even worse. All right.
Joyce, you got your name on the board.
Your name's on the board, Joyce.
Anybody
We're
else
taking
put their name on
names
the
today.
board?
We're taking names today. So, first of all, I think I know why they're sitting at the back table, because there's sweets back there for anybody that wants anything. There's food back there. And Carmel has some Bible studies and songs, if anybody didn't remember to pick up with you. I want to give you attention. I want to make you look this direction. This is Courtney Gertis. This is the last name right? Gertis, yes. Courtney she's been around for quite a while, but she comes second service, and she's one of our greeters. And last semester, at some point, Brittany had taken some ladies to Camp Rudolph for a retreat, and I looked at the pictures, and I was like, Courtney's at the piano playing songs with these ladies, so we did not know. So, now that I know, Louise couldn't be here, of course, and Julie couldn't be here, and Crystal couldn't be here, so Courtney said, I'll do it. So, we're glad Courtney did. She was so excited, she jumped at it. She said, of course I want to be here. Karen, do I need to put your name up? Chris?
I wasn't saying a word.
We'll see.
Just so you spell it right, that's all right.
Gonna give her a star.
Should give her a star.
So people know that people on the list are going to be extra.
She's taught me to talk. It's not my fault.
Just blame it on somebody
Is it
else.
Shirley?
So we're gonna start off this first Wednesday of the new year, making sure that we always give God the glory. That's why I picked this song today, and Courtney knows it, so it worked out. To God be the glory. I need you to sing at the top of your lungs, because some of it's really high. Praise the Lord, Well, Courtney homeschools her kids, so she has to scoot off. We're glad you could fill in, Courtney.
Thank you for having
so
me.
much.
It's so fun to be here.
Yeah. So, our question of the week, or our contest, is, on this day, in 1896,
No, that was before my time.
are you sure? The 45th state was started on this date.
Virginia.
Don't Google it, don't Google it. Does anybody know what it is? The 45th state.
New Mexico.
Not New Mexico. Not Oklahoma. But you're in the vicinity.
Arizona.
Arizona?
No,
Missouri.
no,
Texas.
no,
Colorado.
no,
Nevada.
Wyoming?
no. I'll give you a hint.
Oh, boy.
It's a state that I have not been to yet, that I really want to go to,
Oh, that really clears it up.
because it's got beautiful,
Utah.
yes.
Oh,
Laura, I knew that I wanted to go to Utah, that's right, I forgot.
I was just there.
Laura, this is a prayer calendar that, from the Science of the Bible, so.
Oh, how nice.
Spent 10 days there.
Yes, I just remember having a conversation with her. Okay, so as you can tell, our joke teller is not here. So I came up with some, I didn't come up with them, I researched some good dad jokes. Dad jokes are the new thing nowadays, okay?
Just ask Chris.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go, ready? I'm afraid for the calendar, its days are numbered.
Hey.
Oh, boy.
My wife said I should do lunges to stay in shape. That would be a big step forward.
Hey.
Why do fathers take an extra pair of socks when they go golfing? In case they get a hole in one. Singing in the shower is fun until you get soap in your mouth. Then it's a soap opera. Get it? Okay. That's why they're dad jokes. What do a tick and the Eiffel Tower have in common? They're both parasites. Oh. Do you know what a parasite is? Okay. What do you call a fish wearing a bow tie? Sophisticated.
Oh, where did you find these jokes? Oh, my God.
Laffy Taffy.
love them, wouldn't
If April showers, y'all have heard this one before. If April showers bring Mayflowers, what do Mayflowers bring?
Pilgrim.
Pilgrims! Yes, I knew you'd heard that
Oh,
one.
I have heard that one.
I thought the dryer was shrinking my clothes. Turns out it was the refrigerator all along. Did you get that?
Yeah.
I thought the dryer was shrinking my clothes. Turns out it was the refrigerator all
Oh,
along.
eating too much.
You got it?
Oh, yeah.
All
I'm
right.
gonna put your name up there now.
All right, Chris, it's all you.
Oh, man, Chris.
Good job.
It'll only get better.
That was a sympathy clap, Steve. They're different.
Do what?
That was a sympathy clap.
I know.
Different sound.
Donna's sick today, so
We
she
sure
didn't
do
want
miss
to go.
Donna, don't we? y'all?
Yes, we do.
Steve must have ate a lot of Laffy Taffy before
Bless
coming out
my
here.
heart.
Those are the kind of jokes you find on a Laffy Taffy, for sure.
I have one, Chris, that I saw the other day in the gift shop at Princess Anne Hospital.
Mhm.
And I was standing there and I was looking, and I was like, wow, that's kind of funny. It
Speak
said-
up, speak
it
up.
said, you know, the world is flat. Because if it was round, the cats would have knocked everything off by now.
The world's flat. If it was round, the cats would have knocked everything off by now.
That's true.
It's true, just like the cats try to. We put our Christmas tree up this year. It was a pre-lit artificial. I have really just kind of given up. I used to be one of those that like only would put real trees in, but now that they've become the same price as a house,
Yeah.
with the artificial.
That was a good joke.
So we put the artificial up, and the cool thing about that too is that they're often pre-lit, so you don't have to do much work. You just kind of shake it into shape. That's kind of how I pull it out of the box and shake it real good, and all the branches hopefully fall in the right place. And then the next step, obviously, is where you get the boxes out and you put the ornaments up and all that. Well, we skipped that step this year because we have a toddler in the house who is a destroyer of everything within arm's reach. So not only cats, there's toddlers that would knock everything off of a round planet. That's what we've learned along the way. We are now in the 5th week of studying Elijah. I think it's a 10-week deal, so we're just at halfway point together as we're starting 2023 together. Grateful y'all can make it out this first Wednesday of the year. Grateful for folks who may be joining us online somewhere along the line as well. And hopefully this will be a blessing for you. We're going to be in 1 Kings 18.
Linda's online and she says greetings to all.
Hello, Linda.
Hi,
So
Linda.
Linda had her surgery recently, and hopefully she's doing better. I think she's recovered well from what I've seen from her
No pun
cataract.
intended from what you're seeing.
From what I've seen, yeah, there you go. Dad jokes are coming around.
Oh, boy.
So week 5, and we're going to be 1 Kings 18. And you know, when a year goes by, when a year changes, we have this tendency to look back on the previous year and to think about the best and the worst of the year. I don't know if you've thought about what your best day was in 2022, but that's kind of a fun thing to think through.
Yeah.
Maybe the best movie you watched in 2022. Maybe the worst decision you made in 2022. You'd like to forget that. But we've made good and bad decisions all through the year. What was your best, worst day? All those types of things. Not only do we do this looking back as individuals, but even as a society we do this, as a country we do this. You see it a lot of times in newspapers and magazines. You guys are familiar with the Person of the Year awards that come out with Time magazine, I think, does it, and others probably do it too, like Newsweek and other ones like that. The year-end issues where they talk about the greatest event of the year or the person who's made the most impact. Well, if they had those types of things back in 700 BC, you would wonder if whether or not Elijah would have made the list of one way or another. Maybe if he was on the list, it would not be a famous thing. It would be an infamous thing. Probably the person who would be most wanted in 700 BC. But if you think about his life, he certainly was a remarkable individual who accomplished and experienced remarkable things. So let's do a quick review. 1 Kings 17 has a lot of actually what we've covered in Elijah's life to this point. What were some remarkable events that he was a part of to this point that we've talked about together, studying his life?
Drought.
Okay, so the drought is the beginning of it, right? So Elijah approaches the king of Israel, Ahab, who's an evil king, who is slightly less evil than his wife Jezebel, and he goes to Ahab and predicts that there will be a drought until he says otherwise, because of their faithlessness or their sin. And so he says this is in, I think, the first chapter, verse 1, there shall neither be dew nor rain these years except by my word. And then from there, what happened with Elijah?
We raised the child from the dead.
Okay, so that was where we kind of left things when we left him. That was another thing. But right after he predicted the drought, he goes off to the ravine. And there at the ravine, he's fed by ravens and the water there in the ravine until that dries up. Goes from there to find this widow in a place called Zarephath. And the widow was the mother of this child. And so we know that when he went to the widow didn't think there was anything she could provide him, but miraculously God provided for both her family, her son and her, along with Elijah, through the never-ending jar of oil and flour, and they were able to survive. And then the son passes away fairly quickly, this mysterious illness, and Elijah is then able to bring him back from the dead, the first recorded resurrection of a dead person in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. So, pretty remarkable events to his life so far, and we haven't even gotten to the most remarkable, or at least the most notable achievement, and that's what we're going to look at today. Here's what Swindoll wrote in his book about the same idea of someone being noticed as the person of the year. If Time, Newsweek, and People magazines had been around turned century in 700 BC, would they have included Elijah on one of their lists, if only for one major event in his life? I don't see how anyone summing up the people and events of the previous 100 years could have ignored this significant showdown, this classic fight to the finish between the pagan gods of the earth and the living God in the heavens. Imagine the headlines: the battle of the gods, or the greatest conflict of the century, or even the God who answers by fire, which is the title of the chapter in this book that we are studying together. And so 3 years have gone by since we last saw Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17. We left him off with the widow in Zarephath, and so the total time of the drought essentially was about a little bit over 3 years. And this is where we then pick up things in 1 Kings 18, verse 1. It came about after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, that's where we're getting that time frame from, saying, "Go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth." Now, 3 years earlier, as we talked about, God said to Elijah, "Go hide yourself," and now he's saying to Elijah, "Go show yourself," that's a blank, "go show yourself to Ahab." So he's sending him back in the opposite direction he sent him from before. 3 years earlier, God had said there's going to be a drought in the land. There will be neither rain nor dew until I say so. That's what Elijah passed on from God. And now he says, "I will send rain." So everything's going to reverse now, and we're going to see what comes from that. Now imagine what that room felt like as Ahab walked in for the first time into Elijah walked into Ahab's presence for the first time. What had been happening? Ahab had been seeking Elijah out for all of this time to try, in an attempt to end the drought somehow, probably by what he thought of maybe as killing Elijah. Couldn't find the guy because he's in all these crazy places like the Kerith Ravine and the widow's house. These are places you would least likely find this man. So never found him. And it's not until Elijah just kind of walks right into Ahab's throne room that they encounter each other. We don't have to imagine what that was like. It's described actually in verse 2 and 17. It said, "Elijah went to show himself to Ahab, and now the famine was severe in Samaria. And it came about when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, 'Is this you, you troubler of Israel?'" Now there are occasions where this Hebrew word for troubler is used for viper or asp or snake. So those are all terms that refer to the snake. And troubler is another way of saying, "Is that you, you sorry snake in the grass?" So Ahab's not happy with Elijah, obviously, here. And this is what Ahab thinks of Elijah by now. And I want you to think about the courage it took for Elijah to approach Ahab after all of this. And the faith that it took for him to just walk into this scene and make himself approachable. All the things that Ahab and Jezebel had already done to the people of God, the priests of God, why wouldn't they try to do that to Elijah, especially after all this? But we know that Elijah was not the same man that he was before God called him to this boot camp that he called him to in the Kerith Ravine. Right? Elijah is not intimidated in the least in this situation. I think a lot of that comes from the experience that he had with God's providence through this whole time of the drought. So it continues in verse 18. He said, "I've not troubled Israel," that being Elijah, "but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals." This is the reason for the drought. Elijah's message was severe because Ahab had been so shamelessly disobedient, breaking the first commandment the whole time. First commandment being, "You shall have no other gods before me." So when Elijah tells Ahab, "You've been following the Baals," he's talking about the gods that they had worshipped in that time, these false gods that they put before the real God. he wasn't the only one. And anytime you have someone that has that kind of political influence or power in a society going in that direction, society will surely follow in that same direction from that type of leadership or lack of leadership. And so you have not only Ahab, but so many in Israel that are doing the same thing, this idol worship. And so what was needed was a dramatic showdown between idolatry and the living God. So Elijah makes a plan to assemble a crowd, a whole audience for a showdown between God and these false idols. And here's how this is going to take place, verses 19 through 21. This is Elijah telling Ahab, "Send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So both of these are part of the pantheon of gods, or the number of gods that they had worshipped. Baal and Asherah being the main ones that they had worshipped in that place and time. And so these are the prophets of these two gods who ate at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people, said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. This gives you some insight on the context in which this showdown is happening. This audience gathered on Mount Carmel to witness this showdown, and it was composed of two separate groups. The first group being the prophets, the priests of the false gods of Baal and Asherah. And then you also had the sons of Israel. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? Well, Baal and Asherah were the prominent idols of the day in Israel, and we can see how prominent they were by the fact that there were at least 850 of these prophets who were prominent enough to eat at the queen's table. So they were treated as a noble class in that time. The reference to them eating at Jezebel's table meant that they could basically come and go from the throne room, and they were a part of the feasts and the banquets that were provided there. So they were well respected in that society as priests of these false gods. 850 of them, a lot of them. And then the sons of Israel were the general public who had already been swayed by these false prophets somewhat. But they seemed to be undecided. So if you look at what Elijah's saying to the crowd, he's saying choose, right? He's saying pick. Is it God or these false gods? He's not really talking to the prophets and priests of the false gods. He's talking to the sons of Israel that have gathered to witness all this. And so I think the target audience here is ultimately going to be these undecided people who, when Elijah asks them for a response, are responding with silence because they are undecided. And this is the majority of the people that we still see in the world today. In our country, at our time, majority of the people we run into are undecided. If not in word, in thought, certainly in deed, undecided about whether or not God is real. And so in this crowd, no one is innocent. That's a blank. No one is innocent in this crowd. Everyone has something to learn from what's about to happen. And knowing that people usually need proof to be convinced, Elijah makes certain that many people will witness this climactic showdown. So the reason for the crowd is to convert the minds and hearts of the people who have been led astray by these prophets and priests and false idol-worshipping kings. And then Swindoll describes this moment pretty well in the chapter. Here's a portion of it. He says, Elijah wasn't deterred. He stood there all alone, vastly outnumbered, but absolutely invincible in God's hands. Arrayed before him were the idol-worshipping, undecided people of the land. Standing by were the 850 priests and prophets of Baal and Asherah. No doubt there were idol shrines erected there and there across the summit of Mount Carmel, as there were on most of the mountain peaks of Israel at the time. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He was God's man, and he had a plan that they would be unable to ignore or forget. And here's what it looks like. Verse 22. Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves, and cut it up, and place it on the wood. But you put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put fire under it. Then you call in the name of the Lord your God, or the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered and said, this is a good idea. Okay? Baal was actually known as the god of the sun. He was worshipped as the god of the sun. He was considered to be the fire of the universe. Sun is the blank. God of the sun.
S-U.
S-U.
Yes. Not the son of the god, but the god of the sun. As the all-controlling god of crops and productivity of the land. So if you think about in that culture, in that time, they didn't have much understanding of the universe and science and things like that. And I mean, even now, we can't predict weather but so well. Imagine back then. And for them, they felt like if they made the right sacrifices at the right time, that meant the right amount of sun would hit their crops. And so that was very much linked to their belief that they would live a good year if they were able to worship the right God in the right way. And so Baal, of course, was a popular one that they did that with. If he could do anything, this God of the sun, he ought to be able to start a fire, right? If he's the God of the fire in the universe, that's an easy one for him. And maybe that's why Elijah picked that particular method for the showdown. Just let the God of fire send fire if he's real. So of course everybody felt like, well, that's a fair test. If Baal can't send fire and he's the God of fire, we need to know about it. So that's the condition. Verse 25, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one ox for yourselves, prepare it first for you, are many, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. So the silence above is deafening. If you talk about getting started in the morning, we're not exactly sure at what point in the morning they started up on this and going all the way till noon. You're talking hours of this shouting, but there's nothing but silence from above. And so then, as they saw more and more time pass and no response, they became a little bit more desperate, and their movement became a little bit more drastic. So they're dancing around, and they're yelling even louder and moving around even quicker, leaping about the altar, and I picture Elijah just kind of leaning there watching him, arms crossed, jumping around for several hours. You know. And that's not enough just to kind of sit there and watch him. Elijah decided he's going to jump in and do a little mocking. So he's got his own little dad jokes he's going to throw in here. 1 Kings 18:27. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, well, call out with a loud voice, for he's a god. Either he's occupied or gone aside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened. So he's like, you're not yelling loud enough. You haven't woken him up yet. Maybe your God's on a journey, or perhaps he's fallen sound asleep. You simply have to yell louder and wake him. By this time, they're probably hoarse from yelling for a response from this false god. And the Hebrew word that's translated occupied, where it says either he's occupied or gone aside, suggests that Elijah meant that their God was deep in thought, or perhaps preoccupied. Swindoll notes that some Old Testament scholars believe the wording here suggests that Elijah was taunting them with the idea that Baal may have stepped aside into the celestial men's room for a time. So he was preoccupied. That's the nature of it. Okay, so this mockery doesn't do anything but ramp them up, and they start to escalate their behavior. Verse 28, they cried with a loud voice, cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. And it came about when midday was past that they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Keep in mind, these famous priests, prophets of Baal, these are the rock stars of the area. They could approach and eat at the queen's table. While the masses were suffering under the drought, that's a blank, They had been pampered with food and drink at the queen's table. So they had all this energy to be able to run around and shout and cut themselves and not pass out from the blood loss, all that kind of stuff, because they were able to eat and drink as needed in a time of drought when others were starving. But even that can come to an end. And once they'd spent themselves, Elijah steps onto the scene, gave them basically a whole day from morning till evening sacrifice. And everything Elijah had experienced to this point was preparing him for this movement or this moment of proving God's power. He's seen it enough. He's seen the boy come to life. He's seen the raven bring the food. He's seen just the way that God provides in miraculous ways in His own timing. And he knows better than these false prophets that it's not going to come from the amount of the volume of your yelling or the level of your expression, but it comes from God's power. So verse 30, Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." I'm not going to shout. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. So, there was a couple of altars there. One of them was broken up, the one that Elijah most likely built because these people were dancing and going crazy. So Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." So with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces, laid it on the wood, and he said, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar. And he also filled the trench with water. Let's just make sure this sucker is drenched. So the first thing Elijah did was rebuild the altar of the Lord, which was destroyed already. And so this was to avoid all contact with the altar that had been dedicated and associated with Baal. It's a completely separate altar. Some commentators believe that the term translated pitchers should be barrels. Either way, the point is that they used several very large containers of water to soak this rebuilt altar of God, to eliminate any doubt about where the source of fire is for this sacrifice. People ask, well, wasn't this the end of a 3-year drought? Where's all this water coming from? Good question. Mount Carmel is not very far from the Mediterranean Sea. So they were able to gather this water, which would not have been drinkable, so therefore there's a drought, but you still have a large amount of water that you can use to soak this wood and to provide water for this trench as well from the Mediterranean Sea. So then it continues, verse 36. It came about at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that thou, O Lord, art God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again." That's all he says. Prayers of faith are often simple and concise. He's not pleading and screaming and spinning around and jumping and cutting himself. He is just doing what Moses did and Abraham did and so many others did, reminding God of his promises and of who he is, and then asking from the Lord to show up in this situation. So you can see a clear contrast between the behavior of these priests and this prophet. And you can see a contrast in the response, obviously, with one side having no response after all day of pleading, and the response on Elijah's side was immediate and convincing. A consuming fire shows up. Verse 38. The fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. That's a hot one. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. Remember, I said at the beginning of this text that the intended audience of all of this was not the priests and the prophets. They had already given themselves over to this false worship, and as far as it looks here, they were already judged for that. But there was an audience of these sons of Israel who were undecided. And you can see by the end of this demonstration that they had decided who was God. I think we would have easily seen that as well ourselves. And so after this takes place, then you see people's lives are taken, are ended here. And this isn't a rare thing, especially in the Old Testament. So whenever lives are ended in this way in the Old Testament, it is important for us to understand this isn't an overreaction from an angry God, that he's after the greatest good for the most people in a way that a doctor removes cancerous parts of the body in order to save the person. God has done this several times in order to save humanity in different parts of the world at different times, where there are large groups of people, men, women, and children, who are put to death because of the nature of the sin and idol worship that is happening within that group. Just like the nature of cancer within a body, if that makes sense. So it's not a drastic response, it's the response for the best good for the most people, God's people. Prophets of Baal were an immoral, hostile, and anti-God malignancy in the land of Israel. Elijah knew he had to cut away all evidence of such a godless menace. This is why God would say when you would go into these towns of the Canaanites or the Perizzites or all these Jebusites, all these different pagan worshiping groups of people, God said, eliminate everything. Don't keep anything for yourselves. Don't even allow the people to live, but more than that, even the livestock, everything. Move it aside because there is a malignancy that happens whenever those things remain. They become used to tempt and appeal people back into idol worship. So, that's what happened. And these are the things that we learn from these events. Timeless truths for modern day Elijahs. Number one, when we are sure that we are in the will of God, we are invincible. That's close to a quote that I love from Corrie ten Boom, that there's no safer place than to be in the center of the will of God. Sometimes the will of God leads you to what appears to be places of danger or places of suffering. But you can rest assured, like Daniel in the lion's den, that in the middle of the will of God, that you are invincible, even in those places of danger. I love what Swindoll writes about this. He says the equation is never 850 against 1, referring to the prophets and the priests of the false gods. It's 850 against 1 plus God. In this passage, Elijah spoke 8 times, and every time he commanded. Yes, every time. He didn't shift, he didn't stutter, he didn't suggest. He leveled a command. He wasn't on the defense, he was on the offense. He knew where he stood. The word to describe that, invincible. So that's a confidence that you can have when you are trusting that you're in the will of God. And God will help you understand when you are or not in His will. And I think times where it becomes obvious that we are or are not, we should be able to respond accordingly. Number 2, divided allegiance is as wrong as open idolatry. So remember, you had the 2 types of people that were in that crowd. You had the obvious idolaters and and the priests that were gathering there. Then you had the people who were on the fence with divided allegiance. On the fence was where most of the Israelites were in Elijah's day, and where most people still are in our day. That's because it seems the easiest place to be, right? It's easy for us to not have to make a decision on these things, because if I truly believe that there is a God who is concerned about my life and how I live my life, that's going to require of me to find out more about this God and to live in such a way that honors Him. Well, that's a big responsibility, right? A lot of people avoid even asking the question because the answer requires something of them. And that's why agnosticism is such a popular thing in our time. Most people that you encounter are not atheists who would outright reject that there's a God. Most people would say they don't know, and they're going to leave it that way, because once they start to determine one way or the other, it starts to lead them in directions that they just don't feel like they want to go at the time. So I think that's where a lot of people were even in Elijah's day. But then they encountered this undeniable presence of God that caused them to choose a side. The strongest words that were given in the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, were given to the church of Laodicea. The reason is clear. They were uncommitted. They were neither hot nor cold. And you're talking about people in church, you know? So that's something for us all to be encouraged by, to make sure that we are chasing after the will of God and choosing Him on an everyday basis to make Him first and not to put other things in front of Him, which is idolatry. Third thing, most effective tool is prayer of faith. The most effective tool that we have to overcome difficulties, to find wisdom, to just to deal with evil or suffering or anything in our life is the prayer of faith. Not just your prayer of faith, but even the prayer of faith of people who surround you, which is why we make that a part of our gathering when we get together as well. How many times have we left prayer as a last resort? If we really believe that our most powerful tool is prayer, then it wouldn't be the last thing we relied on. It would be the first thing we would go to. Fourth, never underestimate the power of one totally dedicated life. Elijah was a man all alone, overwhelmingly outnumbered by a hostile king, the king's wicked and powerful wife, 850 pagan prophets and priests of Baal, and countless numbers of unbelieving Israelites, yet all of them were silenced and intimidated by this one dedicated man of God. Never underestimate the power of one dedicated life. I was trying to find this fortune cookie I found. Some of y'all saw it. I posted it on Facebook. Crystal and I were doing like an overnight trip to Williamsburg to get away from all these kids that we have and a grandkid, and we got Chinese takeout, and then I had this fortune cookie that had a quote that was similar to what I just saw there. Most of the time nowadays when you go to a fortune cookie, it's like, your days will be happy, or it's very general, you know? But this one was pretty cool. It said, one person with a belief is equal to the force of 99 who have only interest. I think that's what you saw here in Elijah's encounter. And here's the level of influence that Elijah had. Continues as we finish 1 Kings 18, verse 41. Elijah said to Ahab, go up, eat and drink, for there is sound of the roar of a heavy shower. So Ahab went up to eat and drink. Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, go up now and look toward the sea. So he went up and looked and said, there is nothing. And he said, go back 7 times. And it came about at the 7th time that he said, behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, go up, say to Ahab, behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. Oh, I just repeated the line there. Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, so that the heavy shower does not stop you. So it came about in a little while that the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. So Ahab knew even before the cloud showed up, because of God's promise, that the rain was coming. And even though it took 7 times up the mountain to see this cloud show up, he was not deterred. Elijah staged a magnificent showdown with the prophets of Baal, but the greatest showdown of all time was at Calvary, where the enemy of God was defeated by the sacrifice of God's own Son. Because God had one dedicated life he could count on, his own dear Son. In fact, the difference he made changed all of history. So you talk about the difference of one dedicated life. That was the most profound difference that was ever made by one life. The life of Jesus. So that's what we have for you this week. And we'll get back together and continue in this study of Elijah's life next week, next Wednesday, Lord willing.
Angelique has a question.
Yes, sir.
So were 850 prophets killed or 450?
That's a good question. It said 450, didn't it? I didn't even look at that. It said, let's look back at that text. That would be in verse 40. Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal." They seized them, and Elijah brought down Brook Kishon, slew them there. So you have prophets of Baal, 450 prophets of Baal, and 400 prophets of the Asherah. We're not sure what happened with the prophets of Asherah. My guess is there were more than just the prophets of Baal. But I don't know what happened with, there's nothing that Scripture tells us specifically happened with the prophets of Asherah. So, good question. Sharp eyes out there in the audience. Gotta be ready. Love it.
Okay.
So that's where we're going to be today. We're going to get into some things we can be praying for, as we just talked about. It's the most powerful tool in our body.